The Friday evening sun bled crimson across the limestone hills as I turned off Highway 290 onto the Caliche Road that led to Uncle Emmett's place. Dust rose behind my truck in a pale cloud, and I rolled down the window to let the hill country air wash over me, cedar and mesquite and something underneath that smelled like home. The week had been long. 60 hours of framing houses in a new subdivision east of Austin, and my shoulders ached with the good kind of tired that honest work brings. I was 34 years old, divorced, and spending my weekends on a cattle ranch might have looked like running away to some people. To me, it felt like the only thing keeping me sane. I'd been making this drive every Friday for 2 years now, ever since Sarah signed the papers and I signed away the house, and we both pretended we hadn't wasted 8 years trying to make something work that had been broken from the start. The apartment in Austin was just a place to sleep during the week. The ranch was where I could breathe. The road curved through a stand of live oaks, their branches twisted into shapes that looked almost deliberate, and then the house came into view. A limestone and timber structure my great-grandfather had built in 1923, added onto by each generation since. The porch wrapped around 2 sides, and I could see Uncle Emmett already sitting in his usual spot, a beer sweating in his hand, watching the sun go down, like it was a show he'd paid good money to see. I parked next to his old Ford, the one he swore he'd restore someday and never would, and grabbed my duffel from the back seat. Blue, Emmett's Australian cattle dog, came limping off the porch to greet me. He was 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, and had more heart than any 3 dogs combined. I scratched behind his ears and felt some of the week's tension drain out of my neck. "You look like hammered shit," Emmett called from the porch. "Good to see you too." He was 71, but moved like a man 20 years younger, all raw hide and wire, with hands scarred from a lifetime of work that made my construction calluses look soft. He'd never married, never seemed to want to, and had run this place alone since his brother, my father, had died when I was 12. Emmett had been more of a father to me than Dad ever managed, teaching me to ride and rope and fix what was broken, whether that was a fence line or a broken heart. I dropped into the chair next to him, and he handed me a Shiner Bock from the cooler without a word. The first sip was cold enough to make my teeth ache, and I watched the sky turn from red to purple while the first stars pricked through. "How's the Henderson job?" he asked. "Framing's done. Roofing starts Monday. Foreman's an asshole, but he pays on time." Emmett grunted, which was his way of saying he'd heard worse. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind you can only have with family while the night sounds started up around us. Crickets and tree frogs, and somewhere in the distance, a screech owl calling for a mate. "Cattle are acting strange," Emmett said eventually. I glanced at him. His face was unreadable in the growing dark, all deep lines and shadows. "How so?" "Won't go near the north pasture. Been 3 days now. They just crowd up against the south fence like something's pushing them." He took a long pull from his beer. "Never seen anything like it." "Mountain lion, maybe. We had that one a few years back." "Maybe." But he didn't sound convinced. I let it go. Strange animal behavior wasn't exactly rare out here. Weather changes, predators passing through. 100 things could spook cattle. I finished my beer and grabbed another, and we talked about the price of feed and whether the stock tank needed cleaning and all the small concerns that made up a rancher's life. When the stars were fully out and the air had turned cool, I hauled my tired body inside, showered off the road dust, and fell into the bed in my usual room without bothering to unpack. I dreamed about Sarah, which I hadn't done in months. Her face the way it looked at the end, tired and disappointed, telling me I was always running to something that wasn't her. When I woke at dawn, I couldn't remember if I'd answered her. Saturday started the way it always did. Coffee strong enough to strip paint, eggs and bacon while the sun came up, then out to the barn to check on what needed doing. Emmett had a list that never seemed to get shorter, no matter how many weekends I put in. Today it was fence work on the north line, replacing posts that had rotted through and restringing wire that the deer had knocked down. Blue followed us out to the truck, but stopped at the tailgate, whining. Emmett tried to coax him up, but the dog wouldn't budge, just stood there with his ears flat and his tail tucked. "The hell's gotten into you?" Emmett muttered. Blue had never hesitated to jump in the truck before. He loved riding in the bed, ears flapping in the wind, barking at anything that moved. Now he looked at the open tailgate like it was asking him to walk into a fire. "Leave him," I said. "He's old, probably just stiff." Emmett gave me a look that said he didn't believe that any more than I did, but he got in the cab, and we drove north, without the dog. The north pasture was maybe 300 acres, bordered on one side by the road, and on the other 3 by cedar breaks and limestone outcroppings. It was good grazing land, better than most, with a natural spring that kept a small pond full year round. The cattle should have been scattered across it, doing what cattle do. Instead, when we crested the rise and looked down, I saw them all bunched together near the south gate. Every head of the 63 Emmett ran on this section, packed together like they were waiting to be let through. "Well, shit," Emmett said quietly. We parked near the fence line and got out. The silence hit me first. No birds, no insects, none of the constant background noise that you stop noticing until it's gone. The morning sun was already warm on my back, but something about the stillness made me want to shiver. "You smell that?" Emmett asked. I inhaled, trying to catch whatever he meant. There was something underneath the cedar and the cattle smell, something musky and sharp, like a dog that had rolled in something dead. It was faint, probably carried on the breeze from the breaks to the north. "Cat?" I said, though even as the word left my mouth I knew it was wrong. I'd smelled mountain lion before, and this wasn't it. Emmett didn't answer. He walked along the fence line, his eyes moving over the ground in that slow, methodical way he had when he was tracking something. I followed, not sure what we were looking for, until he stopped and pointed. The grass was flattened in a path maybe 3 feet wide, running from the cedar breaks down toward where the cattle were clustered. Something had walked through here and walked through here recently. The grass was still bent, not yet springing back. "Big," I said. "Big," he agreed. We followed the path back toward the trees, moving slow, Emmett's hand resting on the pistol he wore at his hip. I realized I'd left my rifle in the truck and felt suddenly deeply stupid. The cedar breaks loomed ahead of us, dark even in the morning light, and the smell got stronger as we approached. That wrong, musky stink that sat in the back of my throat like a warning. Emmett stopped at the tree line. I came up beside him and looked into the shadows between the cedars, trying to see what he was seeing. For a long moment there was nothing, just trees and brush and the play of light through branches. Then I saw the tracks. They were pressed into the soft dirt at the edge of the break, clear and deep. My first thought was dog, but no dog left prints that big. My second thought was bear. But there hadn't been bears in the hill country in 100 years. The tracks were maybe 6 inches long, with clear toe marks, and what looked like claw impressions at the front. They came out of the woods, followed the flattened grass toward the pasture, then turned and went back in. "What do you think?" I asked. Emmett was quiet for long enough that I looked over at him. His face had gone pale under the tan, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Something that might have been fear. "I think we should get back to the truck," he said. We didn't speak much on the drive back. Emmett seemed lost in thought, his jaw working like he was chewing on something he couldn't quite swallow. When we got to the house, he went straight to the gun safe in his office, while I started coffee I didn't really want. He came back with his deer rifle, a Winchester .30-06 he'd had since before I was born, and sat down at the kitchen table to clean it, even though I'd seen him clean it just last month. His hands moved automatically, field stripping the weapon with the ease of long practice. But his eyes were somewhere else. "Uncle Emmett, what's going on?" He looked up at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to tell me something. I could see it forming behind his eyes. Some piece of knowledge he'd been carrying alone. Then the moment passed and he shook his head. "Probably just a big cat," he said. "Maybe one came down from the Trans-Pecos. They get bigger out there." Those tracks weren't cat tracks. You'd be surprised what a cat's print can look like in soft dirt. I wanted to push, but there was something in his voice that told me not to. Emmett had never lied to me, not once in my life, but I was suddenly certain he was lying now. Or if not lying, then not telling me everything. That night, I drove into Fredericksburg to pick up supplies Emmett said he needed. Salt blocks, fence staples, a few groceries. It was an hour round trip. The kind of errand I'd made 100 times before. The sun was going down as I headed back, painting the hills in shades of orange and pink, and I had the radio on low, some country station playing songs I half remembered from childhood. I was maybe 10 miles from the ranch when I saw the eyes. They were in the tree line to my right, set back maybe 30 yards from the road, catching my headlights and throwing them back amber green. My first thought was deer. There were always deer along this stretch, and I'd learned to watch for them. But these eyes were wrong. They were too high off the ground, a good 6 feet at least, and they didn't have the shape of a deer's eyes. They were forward-facing, predator's eyes. I slowed the truck without meaning to, my foot easing off the gas while my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The eyes tracked my movement, swiveling slightly as the truck rolled past. There was intelligence there, obvious and undeniable. Not the blank instinct of an animal caught in headlights, but something aware, something watching with purpose. Then they blinked out. I stomped the gas and didn't slow down until I was pulling into Emmett's drive, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands slick on the steering wheel. I sat in the truck for a long minute, trying to convince myself I'd seen a deer standing on a rise, a trick of the terrain that made it look taller than it was. A deer, or maybe a horse, that had gotten loose from somebody's pasture. Anything but what some deeper part of my brain was whispering. When I walked inside, Emmett took one look at my face and poured me a whiskey without asking. "You see something?" he said. "I don't know what I saw." He nodded like that made perfect sense. "Drink that, then we'll talk." But we didn't talk. Not really. I told him about the eyes, and he listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he went to the window and looked out at the darkness like he expected to see something looking back. After a while, he pulled the curtains closed, something I'd never seen him do before, and double-checked the locks on both doors. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll check the game cameras tomorrow. Probably nothing." I lay awake for hours that night, listening to the silence outside my window. No coyotes, no owls, no nightbirds. Just the wind moving through empty dark, and somewhere underneath it, a feeling like something vast and patient was waiting for me to understand. The game camera showed nothing. Emmett had 6 of them set up around the property, motion-activated units that could capture anything moving through their field of view, day or night. We pulled the cards Sunday morning and went through them on his laptop, scrolling through hundreds of images of deer and rabbits and one fat raccoon, looking for anything that might explain the tracks, or the eyes, or the way the cattle still wouldn't go near the north pasture. There was nothing, or rather, there was something. Gaps in the footage. Timestamps that jumped forward 30 minutes or an hour with no images captured. Like something had moved through the camera's zones without triggering them. Emmett pointed out 3 separate instances, his face getting grimmer with each one. "Cameras are old," he said, "probably glitching." "All 6 of them? At the same times?" He didn't answer that. I borrowed his truck that afternoon. Mine was making a noise I didn't like, and I wanted to get it looked at before driving back to Austin, and drove over to Dale Hutchins's place to ask about the goats he'd lost. Dale was Emmett's nearest neighbor, 3 miles down the road, and he'd been ranching this land even longer than my uncle. I found him in his barn, working on a tractor that looked older than both of us combined. He wiped his hands on a rag and shook mine, squinting at me in the afternoon light. "Corvus Thornwood. Emmett's nephew, right? Haven't seen you since that thing with the fence line." "Yes, sir. I was hoping to ask you about those goats you lost." His face tightened. "What about them? What do you think got them?" Dale turned back to his tractor, fiddling with something I couldn't see. "Dogs, probably, maybe a cat, hard to say." "Did you find the bodies?" "Parts of them." He still wasn't looking at me. Nothing I'd want to describe to a man before supper. I waited, but he didn't seem inclined to say more. Finally, I asked, "You seen anything strange out here? Animals acting weird, anything like that?" Dale set down his wrench and faced me. There was something in his eyes that reminded me of the way Emmett had looked at those tracks, a kind of recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. "Son, I've been ranching this land for 47 years. I've seen droughts and floods and cats and coyotes and every kind of trouble the hill country can throw at a man. But I ain't never seen what ain't there, and I'd advise you to do the same." He picked up the wrench again. "Tell your uncle I said hey." I was dismissed. Driving back, I kept thinking about what Dale hadn't said, not about what he'd seen, but about what he'd refused to look at. There was something out here, something the old-timers knew about and had decided collectively to pretend didn't exist. I found Emmett in his office when I got back, loading rounds into a magazine for his Winchester. The bullets caught the light strangely, their tips gleaming silver instead of the usual copper. "What are those?" He didn't look up. "Silver jacket. Cast them myself years ago." "Silver? Like for werewolves?" I meant it as a joke, but it came out wrong, and Emmett's hands went still. "Like for whatever might need killing," he said quietly. "Old habit. Emmett, what the hell is going on?" He set down the magazine and looked at me, His eyes were tired in a way I'd never noticed before, the eyes of a man carrying a weight he couldn't put down. "I don't know," he said. And that's the God's honest truth. I've lived on this land my whole life, and there's things I've seen that I can't explain, things I learned not to ask about. My daddy told me once that some places have old tenants, and the best you can do is live alongside them and not draw their attention. He gestured toward the window, toward the hills, going dark outside. "Whatever's out there, it's been here longer than any of us, and lately it seems like it's getting restless. What do we do?" Emmett picked up the loaded magazine and slid it into the rifle with a click that sounded final. "We keep our heads down, our doors locked, and our eyes open, and we hope it moves on before anyone gets hurt. I should have left then. I should have packed my bag and driven back to Austin and never come back. That would have been the smart thing, the sane thing. Instead, I stayed. Because Emmett was family, and the ranch was the only place that had ever felt like home, and because some stubborn part of me refused to believe that anything could drive me away from the only peace I'd found since Sarah left. That night, I dreamed of eyes watching me from the tree line, and something that walked on two legs but wasn't human, and a voice that might have been the wind whispering a name that sounded almost like mine. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside my window. Not walking, moving with a strange, shuffling gait that didn't match any animal I knew. I lay frozen in the dark, barely breathing, listening as it circled the house once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped directly beneath my window. I heard breathing, low, rhythmic, too deep for a dog, too steady for a cat. And underneath that, something else. A sound like sniffing, like something tasting the air, learning my scent. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I lay there in the dark with my heart threatening to burst through my chest, while something I couldn't see and couldn't name stood outside my window, smelling me, memorizing me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard it move away. The shuffling gait again, retreating toward the north pasture, toward the cedar breaks, where we'd found the tracks. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sun came up, I went outside and looked at the ground beneath my window. The tracks were there. The same tracks we'd found at the tree line, only closer now, close enough to touch. And in the soft dirt beside them, I saw something else. The impression of a hand, fingers spread wide, palm pressed flat against the earth. Not a paw, a hand. But wrong somehow. The proportions off, the fingers too long, the palm too wide. I went inside and found Emmett already at the kitchen table, rifle across his lap, looking like he hadn't slept either. "He came to the house," I said. "I know." His voice was flat, exhausted. I heard it. "What is it, Emmett? And don't tell me you don't know. Because I saw your face when we found those tracks. You know something." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down the rifle and folded his hands on the table, looking at me with eyes that held decades of secrets. "When I was about your age," he said slowly, "my daddy told me a story." Said his daddy told it to him, and his daddy before that. Goes back to when the first Thornwoods came to this land back in the 1850s. They found something already here. Something that lived in the cedar breaks and the limestone caves and the deep places where the water comes up from underground. The Comanche had a name for it, but they wouldn't say it out loud. Said speaking its name gave it power over you. The settlers learned quick that there were places you didn't go after dark, things you didn't look at too closely, sounds you pretended not to hear. And as long as you followed those rules, you could live here. Raise your cattle, grow your crops, have your families. Just don't go looking for what doesn't want to be found. I felt cold, despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. And now, Emmett's face was grim. Now something's changed. I don't know what or why, but it's paying attention in a way it hasn't for a long time. And you... He stopped, his jaw tightening. It knows you're here. It knows your scent, your face. Whatever it's doing it because of you. Why me? I don't know, son, but I think you need to go back to Austin, and I think you need to stay there until this blows over. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him I wasn't going to be driven off my family's land by some story, some backwoods superstition that didn't belong in the 21st century. But I remembered those eyes at the tree line, that inhuman intelligence watching me. I remembered the sound of something breathing beneath my window, the impossible handprint in the dirt. I'll leave tomorrow, I said. Early. Emmett nodded. Relief and something else, something that looked like fear warring in his eyes. But I didn't leave tomorrow. I didn't leave at all. Because that night, as I was packing my bag in the last light of dusk, I looked out my window and saw it standing at the edge of the north pasture, silhouetted against the dying orange sky. It was hunched but tall, its shoulders too broad, its proportions wrong in ways that made my brain ache, trying to process. It stood on two legs like a man, but it wasn't a man. The shape of it was all wrong. The way it held itself, the angle of its head as it watched the house, watched my window. I reached for my phone without thinking, some desperate instinct to document what I was seeing, to prove to myself later that it was real. But the moment my hand moved, the thing dropped to all fours in a movement so fluid and fast that my eye couldn't track it. And then it was gone, vanishing into the cedars with a speed that nothing that big should have been capable of. I stood at the window for a long time after that, my phone forgotten in my trembling hand, watching the darkness gather over the hills and knowing with terrible certainty that tomorrow wouldn't matter. It knew I was leaving, and it wasn't going to let me go. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay in bed with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old house, every whisper of wind through the eaves. My bag sat half-packed on the floor beside me, a mocking reminder of intentions that suddenly seemed laughable. I was going to leave? I was going to drive away from this place, like whatever stood at the edge of that pasture would simply watch me go? The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 34 years of life without ever believing in monsters, kept trying to assert itself. It was a person, that voice insisted. Someone in a costume, maybe. Some sick joke by bored teenagers or a disturbed drifter passing through. The alternative was impossible. Things like what I'd seen didn't exist in the real world, in the world of construction schedules and divorce papers and Friday night beers on the porch. But another part of me, older and deeper, knew better. That part remembered the tracks in the dirt, the handprint beneath my window, the way Blue had pissed himself rather than approach my truck. Animals knew things. They sensed things that humans had forgotten how to perceive, dulled as we were by electric lights and climate control and the comfortable certainty that we sat at the top of the food chain. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant through my window. I felt like I'd been awake for days. My eyes burned, and my head ached, and my hands shook slightly as I pulled on my clothes. Emmett was already in the kitchen when I came down, and from the look of him, he hadn't slept either. The rifle was still across his lap, and there were dark circles under his eyes that aged him 10 years. "You saw it," he said. Not a question. Standing at the north pasture at dusk. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and distant. It went on all fours when I moved. Fast. Too fast. Emmett nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd been dreading. "How big?" "Big, a sheer 7 feet, maybe more. Hard to tell at that distance." I sat down across from him, my legs suddenly weak. "Emmett, what the hell was that thing?" "I told you what I know." "You told me a story, a goddamn ghost story about something the Comanche wouldn't name. That's not an answer." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue with me. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the morning light spreading across the hills. "My father saw it once," he said quietly. "Back in '62. He was checking the fence line on the east side, near where the old Perkins place used to be. Said he came around a stand of cedars, and it was just there, standing in the creek bed, drinking. He said it looked at him, and he looked at it, and then it walked away. Just walked away into the trees, calm as you please. He never went back to that part of the property again. Not once, in 30 years. Did he tell anyone?" "Who would he tell? Who would believe him?" Emmett turned to face me, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like pleading. "That's the thing about living out here, Corvus. You learn to carry things alone. You learn that some truths will only make people think you've lost your mind." I thought about Dale Hutchins, the way he'd refused to meet my eyes when I asked about the goats. I thought about the gaps in the game camera footage, the timestamps that jumped forward with nothing captured. I thought about how the old-timers in this area always seemed to have an unspoken agreement about certain topics, certain places, certain nights, when you stayed inside and didn't ask questions. "I want to see the cameras again," I said, "all of them, and I want to walk the fence line where you found those tracks." Emmett's face went hard. "That's a bad idea." "Maybe. But I need to understand what I'm dealing with. I need to know if this is real or if I'm losing my goddamn mind." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those tired eyes. Then he sighed, the sound of a man accepting something he couldn't change. "Fine. But we go armed, we stay together, and the second either of us sees anything wrong, we get back to the truck. No arguments. Deal?" "Deal." We ate breakfast in silence, neither of us really tasting the food. Emmett moved around the kitchen with the mechanical efficiency of long habit, frying eggs and bacon, pouring coffee that could have stripped varnish. I watched him and thought about all the years he'd lived out here alone. All the nights he must have spent listening to sounds he couldn't explain, pretending not to see things that moved at the edge of his vision. The weight of that solitude suddenly seemed enormous, and I felt a surge of guilt for all the weekends I'd spent here, treating the ranch like my personal therapy retreat, never once asking what burdens my uncle might be carrying. After breakfast, we retrieved the game camera cards and spread them out on Emmett's desk. This time, I went through them slowly, methodically, paying attention to every timestamp, every frame. The gaps were there, just as we'd seen before. 30 minutes here, an hour there. Periods when the camera should have been recording, but captured nothing. But there was something else I'd missed the first time. Something that made my stomach drop. Look at this, I said, pointing at the screen. It was a sequence from the camera on the north fence line, the one closest to the cedar breaks. 3 frames, captured 30 seconds apart. In the first, nothing, just darkness and the infrared glow of the camera's illumination. In the second, nothing again, the same empty view. But in the third, at the very edge of the frame, there was a shape, just the suggestion of something, a darker darkness against the trees, caught by the camera's sensor in the split second before it moved out of view. Could be anything, Emmett said, but his voice had gone tight. Could be. But look at the height. I traced my finger along the shape, trying to gauge its position relative to the fence posts visible in the frame. That's got to be 6 feet off the ground, at least. Could be a deer standing on a rise. At midnight? With no body heat signature? Emmett didn't answer. He just stared at the image, his face gone pale in the light from the laptop screen. We found more, sifting through the hundreds of images captured over the past week. Nothing definitive, nothing that would convince anyone who didn't already believe, but enough to sketch a pattern. The shape, whatever it was, appeared at the edges of 5 different frames, always at night, always just barely visible. It seemed to be circling the property, testing the boundaries, approaching and retreating in a pattern that might have been random but felt deliberate. Hunting behavior, I thought, and then tried not to think about what that implied. The drive out to the north pasture was quiet. The cattle were still clustered at the south fence, and they watched us pass with wide, white-rimmed eyes, their bodies pressed together in a mass of anxious flesh. Blue had refused to come, standing on the porch with his hackles raised, whining as we pulled away. Smart dog, I thought. The tracks were still there, pressed into the dirt at the edge of the cedar breaks. In the full light of morning, they looked somehow worse than I remembered. Clearer, more defined, impossible to mistake for anything normal. I crouched beside them, measuring with my hands, trying to apply some rational framework to what I was seeing. Too big for a dog, I said, too narrow for a bear, and the stride length. I stood up and paced along the flattened grass, counting steps. Whatever made these was taking 7-foot strides, running maybe. Or walking, Emmett said quietly. With legs that long, walking would look like running to us. I didn't want to think about that. I didn't want to imagine something with legs long enough to cover 7 feet in a single step, something that could move through the darkness with that kind of terrible efficiency. But the tracks didn't lie. The evidence was right there in front of me, pressed into the earth like a message I couldn't stop reading. We followed the trail into the cedars, moving slowly, stopping every few yards to listen. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no movement in the underbrush. It was wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The absence of life more disturbing than any sound could have been. Nature doesn't like a vacuum. When all the small creatures go quiet, it means something bigger has taken their place. The tracks led us to a clearing about 100 yards into the trees, a small natural hollow where the limestone broke through the thin soil. In the center of the clearing, I saw something that made my breath catch. Bones. A scattering of them, bleached and gnawed, arranged in a rough circle around a flat stone. They were too big to be from a rabbit or a raccoon, too small to be from cattle. Deer, maybe, or goats. The goats Dale had lost. Jesus, I whispered. Emmett moved past me, his rifle raised, scanning the tree line. This is old, he said. See how the bones are weathered? This has been here for a while. He was right. The bones were dry and brittle, picked clean by time and insects, not fresh kills, but the arrangement bothered me. The careful circle, the way they seemed almost placed rather than scattered. Animals didn't do that. Animals tore at their prey and left the remains where they fell. Something that wasn't an animal had been here. Something that arranged bones in patterns that might have been ritual or might have been play or might have been something else entirely, something I couldn't begin to understand. We should go, I said. Emmett didn't argue. We drove back to the house in silence, neither of us willing to put into words what we'd seen. The sun was fully up now, the hill country spreading out around us in shades of gold and green. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows beneath the cedars. I kept glancing at the rear-view mirror, expecting to see eyes, expecting to see that wrong silhouette stepping out of the trees. There was nothing, just the road behind us, the dust we'd kicked up, the empty land stretching toward the horizon. When we got back, I called Dale Hutchins. "What do you want?" he said when he heard my voice, all the false friendliness from yesterday stripped away. "I found where your goats ended up," I said. "In the cedar breaks north of Emmett's place. They're bones, anyway." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, "You shouldn't have gone looking." I had to know. Know what? That there's things in this world that don't fit in neat little boxes, that some places have old tenants who don't appreciate being poked at. His voice had gone harsh, almost angry. "I've lived here my whole life, boy. My father lived here, and his father before him. We learned a long time ago that some questions don't have answers you want to hear. What is it, Dale? What's really out there?" More silence. Then a sound that might have been a sigh, or might have been a curse. "I don't know," he said finally. "And I don't want to know. My advice? You do the same. Go back to Austin, forget about this place, and don't come back until whatever's stirring decides to settle down again. Sometimes the best thing you can do with a problem is let it solve itself." He hung up before I could respond. I stood in Emmett's kitchen with the phone in my hand, staring out the window at the hills that had always felt like home and now felt like a trap. Dale's words echoed in my head. Old tenants, things that don't fit, questions without answers. The folklore of generations, the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned to live alongside something they couldn't explain. But I couldn't let it go. Some stubborn part of me, the part that had survived a failed marriage and a dozen dead-end jobs and all the small humiliations of a life that hadn't turned out like I'd planned, refused to accept that this was beyond understanding. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something rational underneath all the fear and superstition, some natural phenomenon that had been mythologized over the centuries. I spent the rest of that day on my laptop searching. Escaped exotic animals, feral dogs, genetic abnormalities in wildlife populations, anything that might explain tracks that size, a shape that wrong, behavior that intelligent. The internet offered plenty of possibilities. Stories of circus animals gone wild, cryptid sightings from all over the country, government experiments and alien visitations, and all the usual conspiracy theory nonsense. None of it felt right. None of it matched what I'd seen with my own eyes. By late afternoon, I'd moved on to more esoteric sources. Native American legends from the region, Spanish colonial accounts of strange creatures in the Texas wilderness. Old newspaper clippings from the 1800s, digitized and archived by historical societies, telling stories of settlers who vanished without trace, of livestock found torn apart in ways that defied explanation, of lights seen moving through the cedar breaks on moonless nights. The Comanche, I learned, had called this region the place where the ground bleeds, a reference to the iron-rich springs that sometimes ran red, giving the water the appearance of blood. They'd avoided the limestone caves and the deep arroyos, believing them to be entrances to a world beneath this one, a world inhabited by beings older than humanity. The Spanish missionaries had recorded similar beliefs, noting that their converts refused to travel through certain areas after dark, no matter what incentives or threats were applied. And then I found the reference I'd been dreading, a single paragraph in a journal kept by a German settler in 1878, transcribed and posted by a Texas history enthusiast. We've seen it again, walking the ridge at dusk. Heinrich says it is a bear, but bears do not walk so, with such terrible purpose. It watched us for some minutes before descending into the cedars, and I swear before God that it grinned at us, grinned with teeth that no animal possesses. The Mexicans call it El Perro Negro, the black dog, but it is no dog. It is something older, something that was here before we came and will be here after we are gone. We do not speak of it. We only pray it keeps its distance. El Perro Negro, the black dog. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. The account was over 140 years old, but it could have been written by me. The same ridge, the same cedars, the same watching presence that seemed to take pleasure in being seen. Whatever I'd encountered wasn't new. It had been here for generations, decades, maybe centuries. It had watched families come and go, ranches rise and fall, the whole bloody history of Texas settlement unfold around it. And it was still here, still watching, still waiting. That night I couldn't eat. Emmett made dinner, beef stew, one of his specialties, but the smell of cooked meat turned my stomach. I picked at it, pushing chunks of beef around the bowl, while Emmett watched me with worried eyes. "You've been on that computer all day," he said, "doing research. Find anything?" I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd found? How could I tell him that the thing in the cedar breaks wasn't just some isolated anomaly, but part of a pattern stretching back? Before either of us were born, before the ranch existed, before the first settlers ever set foot in this country. "It's been here a long time," I said finally, "whatever it is. There are accounts going back to the 1870s, maybe earlier. The Comanche knew about it, the Spanish knew about it, everyone who's ever lived on this land has known about it, and they've all agreed to pretend it doesn't exist." Emmett nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd suspected but never wanted to admit. The first thornwood to ranch this land was my great-great-grandfather Samuel. He built the original cabin up where the old stone foundation is now. Family legend says he had a understanding with the land, that he'd seen things in the breaks and made some kind of peace with them. The details got lost over the years, but there was always this sense that we were allowed to be here, tolerated. And now I don't know. Something's changed. Maybe we did something wrong, crossed some line we didn't know existed. Maybe it's just the world getting smaller, all the development in the highways and the people pushing out from the cities. Whatever the reason, it's getting bold, coming closer, paying attention in ways it hasn't for a long time. I looked at him across the table. This man who had been more father to me than my own father, who had taught me everything I knew about work and land and living with your hands in the dirt. He looked old suddenly, old and tired and afraid. I should leave, I said, in the morning. Head back to Austin and stay there. That might be best. Will you come with me? He shook his head. This is my land. My family's land for 150 years. I'm not going to be driven off it by something that doesn't want to show its face. He managed a thin smile. Besides, if it's watching you, better to draw its attention away from here. Give the cattle a chance to settle down. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. Whatever this thing was, it had focused on me for some reason. My scent beneath its nose, my window beneath its watching eyes. If I left, maybe it would follow. Maybe Emmett would be safer with me gone. I pushed back from the table, my appetite completely gone. I'm going to pack. Try to get some sleep. I'll leave at first light. Emmett nodded. I'll keep watch tonight, just in case. I went upstairs to my room, the room I'd slept in every weekend for 2 years, the room where I'd lain awake listening to something breathe beneath my window. My bag was still half packed from the night before. I finished the job mechanically, shoving clothes and toiletries into the duffel without really seeing them. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, turning over everything I'd learned, everything I'd seen. El Perro Negro, the black dog. Except it wasn't a dog, not really. The shape I'd seen at the edge of the pasture had been wrong for any canine, the proportions too human in some ways, too inhuman in others. It walked on 2 legs when it wanted to, dropped to 4 when it needed speed. It had hands, not paws. I'd seen the impression in the dirt, the long fingers splayed wide. It was something that didn't fit any category, something that had been ancient when the first humans walked this continent. I finished packing and sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the darkness gathering over the hills. The sun was just setting, painting the sky in shades of red and purple, and for a moment the land looked peaceful, beautiful, like every postcard of the Texas hill country that had ever been printed. Then I saw the eyes. They were far out, maybe a 1/4 mile, just visible at the tree line where the cedars gave way to open grassland. 2 points of amber-green light, catching the last rays of the sunset and throwing them back at me. They were watching the house, watching my window. My heart stopped, literally stopped, missing a beat before lurching back into an uneven rhythm that made me feel dizzy. I sat frozen on the bed, unable to look away, unable to move, watching those eyes watch me. They were too high. That was the thought that kept circling through my paralyzed brain, the observation I couldn't escape. The eyes were at least 6 feet off the ground, maybe more, and they were perfectly level. Not the tilted angle of an animal with its head down, not the uneven height of something moving through brush. Level and still and fixed directly on my window with an intensity that felt like a physical pressure. I wanted to reach for my phone. I wanted to call down to Emmett, to warn him that it was out there, that it was watching. But I couldn't move. Some ancient part of my brain, the part that remembered when our ancestors were prey, had taken over, locking my muscles in place, keeping me still and silent in the desperate hope that the predator would lose interest and look away. Minutes passed. 5, 10, I couldn't tell. The sun finished setting. the sky fading from purple to black, and still those eyes held steady. In the growing darkness, they seemed brighter, more luminous, like they were generating their own light instead of just reflecting what little remained. Then, slowly, they began to rise. I watched in frozen horror as the eyes lifted, climbing higher into the air, with a smooth, unhurried motion that spoke of something standing up from a crouch. 6 feet became 7. 7 became 8. The eyes kept rising until they were level with the second-floor windows, until whatever was attached to them had to be standing fully upright, a towering shape of darkness against the darker trees. A whimper escaped my throat. I couldn't help it. The sound just came out. A small animal noise of pure terror. And in that moment, something happened that I will remember until the day I die. The eyes blinked. Not both together the way human eyes blink, but one after the other, left, then right, in a deliberate, almost playful sequence, like it was winking at me, like it was saying, "I see you, I know you're watching, and I want you to know that I know." Then the eyes dropped, plunging down toward the ground with stomach-lurching speed, and vanished into the darkness. I don't know how long I sat there after that, shaking so hard my teeth rattled. Long enough for the full dark to settle in, for the stars to come out, for the night sounds to fail to return. Long enough for my racing heart to slow to something approaching normal, for my locked muscles to gradually release, for the ability to think to creep back into my frozen brain. It was playing with me. That was the thought that finally broke through the terror. The wink, the theatrical rise, the deliberate timing. It wasn't just hunting behavior, it was communication. It was telling me something. I see you. I can reach you whenever I want. And there's nothing you can do about it. I got up on legs that felt like rubber and stumbled to the door. Emmett was in the hallway, his rifle in his hands, his face pale in the dim light. "You saw it," he said. "It was at the tree line. It stood up. It must be—" My voice cracked. 8 feet, at least 8 feet tall, and it winked at me, Emmett. It fucking winked. He didn't say anything. He just put a hand on my shoulder and guided me down the stairs, sat me in the living room where the windows were covered and the lights were on and the rifle was within easy reach. "We'll get through the night," he said, "and then you'll leave. Put as many miles between you and this place as you can." I nodded, not trusting my voice. But even as I sat there, surrounded by light and walls and the comforting presence of another human being, I couldn't shake the feeling that distance wouldn't matter, that it had marked me somehow, chosen me for some purpose I couldn't understand, that wherever I went, whatever I did, those luminous predator's eyes would be watching, waiting, patient as only something ancient can be patient. I tried to sleep on the couch, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape rising against the trees, those eyes blinking in deliberate sequence. I heard sounds outside, rustling in the bushes, something that might have been footsteps, a low sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a laugh. Emmett sat in the armchair across from me, his rifle across his lap, watching the covered windows like he expected something to come crashing through at any moment. Neither of us slept that night. We just waited, 2 men in a pool of electric light, listening to something move through the darkness outside, circling the house, testing the walls, letting us know it was there. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. My eyes burned, and my head ached, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. no matter how hard I pressed them together. Emmett made coffee, but neither of us drank it. We just stood in the kitchen, watching the light spread across the hills, waiting to see if whatever had been out there all night had finally gone. The silence was absolute. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the world still and heavy and wrong. "I need to go," I said. Emmett nodded. "Take the highway. Don't stop until you hit Austin." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I've been dealing with this land my whole life. I know how to stay quiet, how to not draw attention. You just focus on getting out." I wanted to argue, to insist that he come with me, but the look in his eyes stopped me. This was his home, his birthright, the only place he'd ever belonged. He would rather die here than abandon it to something that had been ancient when his great-great-grandfather was born. I grabbed my bag from upstairs, moving quickly, not looking at the window where I'd seen those eyes. My truck was parked by the house, right where I'd left it, and in the morning light it looked normal, ordinary. A machine designed to take me away from this nightmare and back to a world that made sense. I threw my bag in the back and climbed behind the wheel. Emmett stood on the porch, the rifle still in his hands, watching me with those tired, haunted eyes. "Call me when you get home," he said. "I will. And Corvus?" He paused like he was weighing his next words carefully. "Don't come back. Not for a while. Let things settle. Let it forget about you." I nodded, started the engine, and pulled out of the drive. The road unspooled ahead of me, familiar and unfamiliar at once. I'd driven this route 100 times, but now every curve felt dangerous, every shadow a potential hiding place. I kept my eyes on the road, checking the mirrors every few seconds, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the empty morning, the abandoned farmhouses, the rusted fences that marked the boundaries of land no one had worked in years. I let myself breathe a little easier, let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I was going to make it. I was 15 miles from the ranch when the truck started to shudder. At first I thought it was just a rough patch of road, but the shuddering continued, getting worse with each passing second. The engine coughed, stammered, and died. I pulled onto the shoulder, my heart already racing, and tried the ignition. Nothing. Not even a click. "No," I said, my voice cracked and desperate. No, come on. Start. Please start." I turned the key again and again, pumping the gas, begging the truck to come back to life. But it just sat there, silent and dead, stranding me on a deserted stretch of road with nothing but cedar breaks and empty fields in every direction. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, trying not to panic. It was morning. Full daylight. Whatever was out there, it only came out at night. I had hours before dark. Plenty of time to figure something out. But even as I tried to convince myself, I remembered the way it had circled the house in broad daylight, the tracks we'd found in the morning sun. It was watching during the day. It just chose not to show itself. Until now. I looked in the rear view mirror, and my blood turned to ice. It was standing at the edge of the road, maybe 50 yards behind the truck, where a stand of cedars gave way to open ground. The full light of morning fell on it, and for the first time I could see it clearly, see it in a way that I would give anything to unsee. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, even in its hunched posture, with shoulders that seemed too wide for any natural creature. Its body was covered in coarse fur, the color of drought-dead grass, patchy in places where the skin showed through, gray and wrinkled and wrong. Its legs bent backward at the knee like a dog's, but its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands that were horribly, undeniably human except for the claws. And its face, God, its face. It had a snout, long and lupine, filled with teeth that gleamed white in the morning sun. But its eyes were forward-facing, predator's eyes, set in a skull that was neither dog nor human, but something terrible in between. And in those eyes I saw something that froze me more completely than all the rest. Intelligence, awareness, recognition, it knew me. It had been watching me for days, learning my face, my scent, my patterns. And now it was here, standing in the morning light, letting me see it, showing me what I was dealing with. The truck wouldn't start. I was alone on an empty road, and the thing I'd been running from was standing 50 yards away, watching me with eyes that held something worse than hunger. It grinned. I swear to God, it grinned. Its lips pulling back to reveal more teeth than any mouth should hold. Its tongue lolling between its jaws in an expression that might have been amusement, might have been anticipation, might have been something I didn't have words for. Then it began to walk toward me. Not run, not charge. Just a slow, deliberate walk, each backward bending step eating up the distance between us with terrible efficiency. Its eyes never left my face. Its grin never wavered. I threw myself out of the truck. I don't remember making the decision. One moment I was frozen behind the wheel. The next I was stumbling across the road, my legs barely supporting me, running toward the opposite tree line without any plan except to get away, to put something between me and that thing, to survive for one more minute, one more second. Behind me I heard a sound that might have been laughter. The cedars swallowed me whole, branches clawing at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush without any thought except forward, away, survive. My boots caught on roots and rocks, sending me stumbling, nearly falling. But somehow I kept moving, my body operating on pure animal instinct, while my mind screamed in frequencies I didn't know existed. The laughter, if that's what it was, echoed behind me, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the limestone outcroppings and twisted trees, until I couldn't tell if it was 10 feet behind me or 100. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, until the cedar break opened onto a dry creek bed lined with smooth white stones and steep banks carved by flash floods long past. I half slid, half fell down the bank, landing hard on the rocks, my ankle twisting beneath me with a spike of pain that barely registered through the adrenaline. I pressed myself against the bank, hidden in the shadow of an overhang where the roots of an ancient oak had been exposed by decades of erosion, and I waited, listened. At first, there was nothing but my own ragged breathing, my heartbeat pounding so loud in my ears that I was certain anything within a mile could hear it. Then the sounds of the morning began to filter back in. Wind through the leaves, the distant call of a crow, the buzz of cicadas warming up for the day. Normal sounds, safe sounds. But underneath them, woven through them like a poison thread, I heard something else. Footsteps. Not running, not crashing through brush like I had. Just slow, deliberate footsteps, each one accompanied by a soft rustle of branches being pushed aside with almost casual indifference. It was tracking me. Not chasing, tracking. Taking its time, following my trail through the cedars with the patience of something that knew its prey had nowhere to go. I pressed my hand over my mouth to muffle my breathing, my eyes fixed on the top of the creek bank where I'd come down. The overhang gave me cover, but if it looked down from above, if it came down the bank after me, I'd be trapped. The creek bed stretched in both directions, upstream toward rougher country, downstream toward what I thought might be another road. But I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, didn't dare do anything except crouch in the shadows and pray that it would pass me by. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell over the creek bed like a shroud, heavy and absolute. Even the cicadas had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stared at the top of the bank, at the tangle of roots and grass and stone where the morning light fell in golden shafts, and I waited for the shadow to appear. Waited for those terrible, glowing eyes to look down and find me. Waited for the grin. Minutes passed, or hours, or seconds. Time had become meaningless, measured only in the thunder of my pulse and the burning in my lungs from holding my breath too long. I heard myself whimpering, a thin sound that escaped my lips despite my best efforts, and I hated myself for the weakness, even as I couldn't stop it. Then I heard something else. Breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing, coming from directly above me, close enough that I could hear the wet sound of air moving through a throat, through lungs, through a body that was impossibly large and impossibly near. It was right there, right above the overhang, standing where I couldn't see it, but it must have been able to smell me, hear me, sense the terror radiating from my body, like heat from a fire. A drop of something wet fell onto my shoulder. I looked down at it in the dim light, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It was thick, viscous, slightly yellowish. Saliva. It was drooling on me, standing at the edge of the overhang, its head hanging down just out of sight. And it was drooling on me like a dog anticipating a meal. Another drop fell, then another. I heard its breathing change, becoming faster, more excited, accompanied by a low rumble that might have been a growl or might have been something worse. And then I heard a new sound, the click of claws on stone as it began to move, to shift its weight, to prepare itself for something that I knew I wouldn't survive. I ran. There was no thought in it, no plan, no strategy, just pure blind panic, launching me out of my hiding spot and down the creek bed toward whatever lay downstream. The rocks shifted and rolled beneath my boots, threatening to send me sprawling with every step, but I didn't slow down, didn't look back, didn't do anything except run like death itself was behind me, because it was. I heard it land in the creek bed with a heavy thud, heard the clatter of stones as it started after me, heard that horrible laughter again rising up behind me as it gave chase. But this time there was something different, something almost playful in the way it moved. It wasn't running at full speed. It was jogging, loping along with an easy grace that mocked my desperate sprint. It was faster than me. It knew it was faster than me. And it wanted me to know it too. The creek bed curved around a bend, and I saw something up ahead. A culvert, a concrete tunnel maybe 4 feet in diameter that passed under what had to be a road. Too small for it to follow. Too small for it to fit. I poured everything I had left into a final burst of speed. My lungs screaming, my legs burning, my entire body held together by nothing but will and terror. I dove into the culvert head first, scraping my hands and knees on the rough concrete, and scrambled through the darkness toward the circle of light at the far end. Behind me, I heard it reach the opening, heard the scratch of claws on concrete as it tried to follow, heard a sound of frustration that was horribly, unmistakably human. Then I heard it speak. Not words, not exactly, but sounds that were shaped like words, that carried the weight and rhythm of language, that seemed to mean something even if I couldn't understand what. Its voice was deep and rough, like gravel being crushed, like bones being ground together, and it echoed through the culvert with a resonance that made my teeth ache. I didn't stop to listen. I kept crawling, kept moving, kept dragging myself toward the light, until I burst out the other end of the culvert and found myself in a drainage ditch beside what looked like the same road I'd broken down on, or a road like it, straight and empty and shimmering in the morning heat. I pulled myself up the side of the ditch, my fingers digging into the gravel shoulder, and looked back at the culvert. Nothing emerged. Nothing followed. But I could hear it, still back there in the darkness, making those sounds that weren't quite words, speaking in a language older than anything I had names for. The road stretched in both directions, empty and silent under the Texas sun. I had no idea where I was, no idea how far I'd run, no idea which direction would take me to help or deeper into territory that belonged to something that shouldn't exist. But I couldn't stay here, couldn't wait for it to find another way around, to emerge from the cedars somewhere else, to resume its patient, playful hunt. I picked a direction, left toward what I thought might be east, and started walking. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning cool and replacing it with the relentless heat of a Texas summer. My throat was parched, my lips cracked, my body screaming for water I didn't have. My ankle throbbed where I'd twisted it, sending spikes of pain up my leg with every step. But I kept moving, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was stopping, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I stopped, I would die. I walked for what felt like hours, past empty fields and sagging fence lines and rusted cattle guards that hadn't seen use in decades. The road seemed to go on forever, never rising, never falling, just cutting straight through country that looked the same in every direction. I kept glancing over my shoulder, kept scanning the tree lines, kept listening for footsteps that never came. But I could feel it watching. I don't know how to explain that sensation to someone who's never felt it. The weight of eyes on your back, the certainty of being observed by something that means you harm. It was there somewhere, tracking me from a distance, staying out of sight but never letting me out of its. The sun couldn't touch it, the daylight couldn't drive it away. It had shown itself to me in full morning light, had chased me through the cedars with the sun streaming down, had proven that all the rules I'd believed about such creatures were lies. Finally, blessedly, I saw something ahead. A gas station, small and weathered, sitting at a crossroads like a beacon of salvation. The sign above the pumps was faded almost to illegibility, but I could make out enough to know it was open. A hand-painted gas and beer, and what might have been cold drinks beneath it. A rusted Ford pickup sat in the parking lot, and through the grimy windows I could see lights on inside. I broke into a shambling run, my ankle screaming in protest, my legs threatening to give out with every step. The bell above the door jangled when I pushed through, and the blast of air conditioning hit me like a wave, so cold and clean and perfect that I almost wept. The man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper, his eyes going wide at the sight of me. I must have looked like hell, covered in dirt and scratches, my clothes torn, my face probably white with shock and exhaustion. He was maybe 60, with a thick gray mustache and a Stetson pushed back on his head. And he had the look of a man who'd seen some things, but nothing quite like what had just stumbled into his store. "Jesus Christ, son," he said, setting down his paper and reaching for something under the counter. "What the hell happened to you?" I tried to answer, tried to form words, but all that came out was a croak that turned into a cough, that turned into something that might have been sobbing. I braced myself against a display of candy bars, my legs finally giving out, and slid down to the floor while the world spun around me. The man came out from behind the counter with a bottle of water and pressed it into my hands. "Here, drink this. Easy now. Just drink." I drained half the bottle in one long pull, the cold water burning my throat in the best possible way. Then I looked up at him, at this stranger who represented everything normal and safe and sane, and I said the first coherent thing I'd said in what felt like forever. "There's something out there." His face changed. Not much. Just a tightening around the eyes. A subtle shift in the way he held himself, but enough for me to notice, enough for me to understand that he knew. Somehow, in some way, he knew exactly what I was talking about. "You see it?" he asked, his voice dropping low. "The thing out by the old Comanche crossing?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He was quiet for a moment, studying me with eyes that had gone hard and careful. Then he sighed, a sound of resignation and old grief, and reached into his back pocket for his phone. "I'll call the sheriff," he said. "Get someone out here to take you home. But son, I'm going to give you some advice, and I want you to listen good." He crouched down so we were at eye level, his face inches from mine. "Whatever you saw out there, whatever you think you saw, you didn't. You had car trouble and walked through rough country and got a little spooked, that's all. And that's what you tell the sheriff. That's what you tell your family. That's what you tell yourself every day until you start to believe it. Because the alternative..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "It's not going to let me go," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and empty. "I saw it. It saw me. It knows my face." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Pity, maybe, or recognition. "Where you from, son?" "Austin, but I was staying at my uncle's ranch west of Fredericksburg, the Thornwood place." His eyebrows went up. "Emmett Thornwood's your uncle? You know him?" "Know of him. Everybody out here knows of Emmett." He paused, seemed to be weighing something. "Your uncle's made it 60 years on that land without getting himself killed, despite a lot of things. You might want to ask him how he's managed that." Before I could respond, the bell above the door jangled again. I turned, my heart stopping in my chest, expecting to see it there, that impossible shape silhouetted against the morning light. Finally, come to finish what it started. But it was just a woman, middle-aged, with a sun-weathered face and a faded denim jacket, looking at me with the same expression the man had worn when I first stumbled in. "Ralph, is he..." she started, then stopped when she saw my face. "Oh, Lord. It's happened again, hasn't it?" "Go call the sheriff, June," Ralph said, not taking his eyes off me. "Tell him we got another one." Another one. The words echoed in my head as the woman disappeared into the back room, as Ralph helped me up and guided me to a plastic chair by the window. As the minutes ticked by and the sun continued its arc across the sky. Another one. There had been others. People like me who had seen something they shouldn't have, who had run and fought and somehow survived. I wondered how many of them were still alive. I wondered how many of them had stayed that way. The sheriff's deputy who arrived an hour later was young and skeptical, with a thick drawl and a notepad he never wrote in. He asked me questions about my truck, about where I'd been, about how I'd ended up at Ralph's gas station. I gave him the answers Ralph had coached me on: car trouble, rough terrain, got turned around in the cedars. He nodded like he'd heard it all before, like this was just another story from another crazy tourist who'd gotten lost in the hill country. "We'll send someone out to tow your truck," he said, tucking his notepad into his pocket. "You got someone who can pick you up?" "My uncle," I said, "Emmett Thornwood." The deputy's expression flickered just for a second before settling back into professional neutrality. "Right. I'll let him know you're here." He left, and I sat in that plastic chair by the window, staring out at the empty road, waiting for Emmett to come. Ralph brought me coffee and a stale Danish from the display case, and he sat with me without saying anything, the way you'd sit with someone who'd just lost everything they thought they knew about the world. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the sun to reach its peak and begin its slow descent toward evening. Long enough for the shadows to start lengthening, for the heat to begin bleeding out of the day. Long enough for me to start thinking about what would happen when darkness fell. It was out there. I could feel it, still watching from wherever it had hidden itself, waiting for the moment when the sun dropped below the horizon and the night belonged to it again. The culvert had bought me time. Ralph's gas station had given me shelter. But these were temporary reprieves, band-aids on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. It had seen me. It knew my face. And whatever it was, whatever ancient and terrible thing wore the shape of wolf and man and nightmare, it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. Emmett's truck pulled into the parking lot just as the sun began its final plunge toward the hills. He stepped out, looking older than I'd ever seen him, his face carved into lines of worry and something else, a kind of grim acceptance. Like a man watching a storm he'd known was coming finally break over the horizon. "Come on, son," he said, holding open the passenger door. "We need to talk." I got into the truck without a word, and we pulled out of the parking lot onto that empty stretch of road, heading west toward the ranch, toward the place where all of this had started. The sun was a ball of red fire on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise, and I watched it sink lower with every mile we covered. "You saw it," Emmett said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "All of it? Not just the eyes, not just the shape, the whole thing?" "In full daylight, right there on the road. It chased me through the cedars." I paused, swallowed hard. "It spoke to me, Emmett. I don't know what it said, but it spoke." Emmett was quiet for a long moment, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about my uncle and the land he'd lived on for 60 years. "Your grandmother saw it too, in 1962, when your father and I were just boys. She never spoke about it after, not even to my father. But I found her diary after she passed." He glanced at me, his eyes dark with old pain. She drew it, every detail. The hands, the teeth, the way it stood. She knew exactly what you saw because she saw the same thing. "What is it?" I asked, though I knew he wouldn't have an answer, couldn't have an answer. "I don't know," he said. "Nobody knows. It's been out here longer than the Comanche, longer than anybody. The land remembers it, even if we try to forget." He took a deep breath. But I know some things. I know it has rules, boundaries it won't or can't cross. And I know there are ways to make it leave you alone if you're lucky, if you're smart, if you're willing to accept certain things that most people aren't willing to accept. What things? Emmett didn't answer right away. We were getting close to the ranch now. I could see the familiar shape of the hills rising up against the dying light, could make out the silhouette of the old barn standing dark against the fading sky. Your grandmother, he said finally. She learned something during her encounter, something that kept her safe for the rest of her life. She wrote it down in her diary, the last entry, before she stopped writing entirely. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. I've never told anyone about this, not your father, not your mother, not anyone. But I think it's time you knew. He handed me the paper and I unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was faded but still legible, a woman's script, careful and precise despite what must have been terrible fear. There were only a few lines, but they burned themselves into my memory the moment I read them. It doesn't want our deaths, she had written. That's not why it watches. It's lonely. It's the last of its kind, and it's been alone for so long that it's forgotten how to be anything else. It takes people because it wants company. It keeps them. I don't know where, I don't know how, but it keeps them. And they become part of its world, its silence, its endless watching. Below that, in different ink, added later, I made it understand that I belonged to the land, not to it, that I would stay and tend the earth and raise my family and live my life, and in return I would not fear it, and I would not try to drive it away. It's still out there, it watches sometimes on quiet nights. But it doesn't take me, it knows I'm not running, it knows I've made my choice. And below that, one final line. The ones who run are the ones it wants most. The sun was gone. The twilight was fading fast, and somewhere in the darkness gathering over the hills, I knew it was out there, watching, waiting, deciding what to do about the man who had seen its face and lived. She made a deal, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Not a deal, Emmett corrected, an understanding. She stopped being prey. She became, I don't know, a neighbor, I guess, someone who shared the land with it instead of someone running across its territory. And you? Did you make the same understanding? Emmett nodded slowly. After she died, it came to the ranch more often, circling, watching. I think it was looking for her, or maybe for someone to take her place. He pulled up to the ranch house, killed the engine, and turned to face me. I told it what she told it all those years ago. That I belonged here, that I wasn't running, that the land was big enough for both of us. And it worked. It hasn't taken me yet. The darkness was complete now, pressing against the truck windows like a living thing. Somewhere out in the night, I heard a sound. Not a howl, not a growl, but something in between. Something that might have been a question. I can't stay here, I said. I can't spend the rest of my life on this ranch, waiting for that thing to decide I've broken some rule I don't understand. Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You can do whatever you want, Corvus. You can run back to Austin, back to Houston, back to wherever you think is far enough. But here's what I need you to understand. It showed you its face. It lets you see it in full daylight, something it doesn't do for just anyone. That means something. I don't know what, but it means something. Maybe it means it's going to kill me. Maybe, or maybe. He stopped, shook his head. I don't know. Your grandmother's diary, the things I've seen over the years, none of it gives me a clear answer. But I know this. The people who try to forget, who pretend they never saw anything, who go back to their regular lives and act like this didn't happen, those are the ones who disappear. The ones who acknowledge it, who find a way to live with the truth. They survive. I sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the darkness, at the shape of hills I'd known my whole life, at the land that had hidden a monster longer than human memory. I need time, I said finally. I need to think. You've got tonight, Emmett said. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. We went inside into the warmth and light of the old ranch house, and Emmett locked the doors behind us with a ritual precision that I now understood in ways I hadn't before. The locks weren't meant to keep it out. Nothing could keep it out, not really. But they were a symbol, a declaration, a way of saying, this is my space, my territory, my home. The night passed slowly. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, and instead sat in the living room with the lights on and Emmett's rifle across my lap, watching the windows, watching the darkness, watching for any sign of movement. Emmett sat with me for a while, but eventually his age won out over his worry, and he went to bed with a promise that we'd talk more in the morning. I sat alone in the yellow lamplight, and I thought about everything I'd seen and heard and felt in the past few days. The eyes at the tree line, the silhouette on the ridge, the sound beneath my window in the darkness, the full horror of its form revealed on that empty stretch of road, the chase through the cedars, the culvert, the gas station, the diary. And I thought about what Emmett had said, about belonging, about understanding, about the difference between running and staying. Just before dawn, when the sky began to lighten in the east and the first birds started to call, I heard it. Not a howl, not a growl, not laughter or words or anything I could put a name to. Just a sound, low and sustained, rising from somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch house, carrying across the still morning air like a message, like a question, like a farewell. I went to the window and looked out. It was there, standing at the far edge of the property, at the line where the cleared land gave way to the wild country beyond. Silhouetted against the pale glow of approaching sunrise, it stood tall on its backward bent legs, its arms hanging loose at its sides, its head tilted slightly as if considering something important. Our eyes met across the distance, mine human and frightened, its ancient and unreadable. And in that moment I felt something I hadn't expected. Not terror, not exactly. Something more like recognition. It knew me. It had watched me for days, hunted me through the cedars, chased me down an empty road. It had let me see its true face, had spoken to me in a language older than words. And now it was standing there, waiting for me to make a choice, run or stay, prey or neighbor, fear or understanding. The sun broke over the hills, spilling golden light across the ranch, and the creature, the thing, stepped backward into the shadows of the trees and was gone. I stood at the window for a long time after that, watching the day begin, thinking about all the years that stretched out ahead of me and the choice that waited at the center of them. Emmett found me there when he woke up, and we sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee, not talking about what we'd both seen, both felt, both understood without words. That was the morning I started to become something different. That was the morning I stopped running. The morning I stopped running was also the morning I understood that running had never really been an option. Not truly, not in the way I'd imagined it, packing my truck and driving south toward Austin, toward Houston, toward the anonymous safety of city lights and crowded streets, and the comfortable illusion that concrete and steel could keep out something that had walked this land since before the first humans crossed the ice bridge from Asia. Emmett and I sat in the kitchen for most of that day, drinking coffee until my hands shook from caffeine rather than fear, and then switching to whiskey when the afternoon sun slanted through the windows and painted everything gold. We talked about practical things at first, the cattle, the fences, the feed schedule that needed attention. But eventually the conversation circled back to what we both knew was the only thing that mattered. "So what now?" I asked, staring into my glass. "I just stay here? Become like you, spending the rest of my life waiting for that thing to decide whether I've earned its approval or its teeth?" Emmett shook his head slowly. "That's not how it works. At least I don't think it is. You don't wait for approval, Corvus. You live your life, same as always. But you do it with your eyes open. You accept that there's more to this world than what's written in textbooks and talked about in churches. You acknowledge the old things, the wild things, the things that don't fit into neat categories, and in return, mostly, they leave you alone. Mostly. He took a long pull from his own glass. There are no guarantees. Never have been. The people who disappeared over the years, the ones whose names ended up in my mother's diary, some of them probably did everything right and still ended up dead. That's the nature of dealing with something you can't control, can't predict, can't fully understand. But the ones who survived, who thrived even, they all had one thing in common. They stopped pretending it wasn't real. I thought about that for a long moment. Thought about Sarah, my ex-wife, who had never understood why I needed these weekends at the ranch. Why the open country called to me in ways the city never could. Thought about my co-workers in Austin who saw the hills as nothing more than a backdrop for weekend hiking trips and Instagram photos. Thought about every person I'd ever known who lived their whole lives without ever glimpsing the darkness that waited at the edges of the world. "I don't know if I can do that," I said finally. "I don't know if I can just accept this and go back to my regular life like nothing happened." "No one's asking you to go back to your regular life." Emmett's voice was gentle but firm. "That life is over. It ended the moment you saw those eyes at the tree line, maybe even before that. Maybe it ended the first time you felt that wrongness in the air, that silence where there should have been sound. The question isn't whether things have changed. The question is what kind of person you're going to become now that you know the truth." I stayed at the ranch for another week after that. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. I just kept finding reasons not to leave. The fence in the north pasture still needed repairs. The cattle needed to be moved to fresh grazing. Blue needed someone to throw the ball for him in the evenings, even if the old dog still refused to venture more than a few yards from the porch after dark. And every night, just before I went to bed, I would stand at the window and look out at the darkness. Sometimes I saw nothing. Sometimes I saw eyes, amber green and patient, watching from the tree line. Once, on the fourth night, I saw the silhouette again, tall and wrong, standing on the ridge where I'd first glimpsed its true shape, outlined against a sky full of stars. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I just looked back, acknowledging what was there. And after a few moments, the shape melted back into the darkness and left me alone with the sound of my own breathing. It was progress of a sort. On the 8th day, I called my boss at the construction company in Austin and told him I needed an indefinite leave of absence. He wasn't happy. We were in the middle of 3 projects, and my absence would mean delays and overtime for the other guys. but he'd known me long enough to hear something in my voice that stopped him from arguing too hard. "Personal stuff, Horatio?" he asked. "Family stuff. My uncle needs help on the ranch. Could be a few weeks, could be longer. I honestly don't know." There was a pause on the line. "Corvus, is everything okay? You sound different." Different. That was one word for it. I thought about all the things I could say, all the explanations I could offer, and in the end, I settled for the only truth that mattered. "I'm figuring some things out. I'll let you know when I know more." "Take the time you need," he said finally. "Job will be here when you're ready." I wasn't sure that was true. I wasn't sure about anything anymore, except that I couldn't leave this ranch, this land, this place, where something ancient and terrible had chosen to reveal itself to me. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The second week brought new routines. I started helping Emmett with the morning chores, feeding the livestock, checking the water tanks, walking the fence lines to look for damage. The work was physical and exhausting in a way that left no room for the kind of overthinking that had plagued my nights in Austin. By the time the sun went down, I was tired enough to sleep, and my dreams, while strange, were no longer nightmares. I started reading the diary again, this time more carefully. My grandmother's handwriting was difficult to decipher in places, her spelling inconsistent, her grammar that of a woman who'd grown up speaking German at home and English everywhere else. But the more I read, the more I understood what she'd been trying to convey. The creature, the thing, had many names in her pages. She called it the wolf that walks, the night hunter, the old neighbor. Once, in a passage that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, she referred to it as der Waldschrat who remembers. The forest spirit who remembers? Remembers what? I never found out. But I understood now why Emmett had said that it had been here longer than human memory, because according to my grandmother's diary, it had been here longer than human settlement, longer than the tribes who hunted these hills before the Spanish came, longer perhaps than the hills themselves. It was not, she wrote, a thing that could be killed, not by bullets or blades or fire or any human weapon. It was a thing that simply was like the wind or the stone or the slow turning of the earth, and humans who encountered it had only two choices: to live with that knowledge or to die trying to deny it. "How many people know?" I asked Emmett one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed red over the limestone ridges. "In this county, I mean. How many people have seen it?" He considered the question for a long moment. "More than you'd think. Fewer than you'd hope. The ranching families, mostly, the ones who've been here for generations, who still remember the old ways even if they don't talk about them in polite company. Some of the hunters, the ones who spend enough time in the back country to notice when something's wrong. A few outsiders who stumbled into the truth by accident and were smart enough not to deny it. And they all just live with it, pretend everything's normal. What's the alternative?" Emmett shrugged. "You can't fight it, you can't kill it, you can't run far enough to escape something that's been here since before there was anywhere to run to. So yes, they live with it. They make their peace. They teach their children to be careful in the wild places after dark, to respect the old things, to never assume they're alone just because they can't see anyone watching." He took a sip of his beer. "It's not so different from any other truth that people learn to carry. The world is full of hard knowledge, Corvus. This is just one more piece of it. I thought about that for a long time after he went inside. Thought about all the hard truths I'd learned in my 34 years. That marriages end, that people die, that the universe doesn't care about human plans or hopes or dreams. Thought about how I'd survived those revelations. How I'd found ways to keep living even when living seemed like the hardest thing in the world. Maybe this was the same. Just one more truth to carry. That night, for the first time since the chase through the cedars, I went outside after dark. I didn't go far, just to the edge of the porch, just far enough to feel the cool night air on my face and see the stars wheel overhead in a display that city lights had long since stolen from me. Blue pressed against my legs, trembling slightly but refusing to abandon me, and I reached down to scratch behind his ears while I stared out at the darkness beyond the ranch house lights. "I know you're out there," I said quietly, speaking to the night, to the hills, to whatever might be listening. "I know what you are. Or at least I know enough to understand that I'll never really know what you are. But I'm not running anymore. I'm not pretending. I'm here, and I see you, and I'm going to find a way to live with that." For a long moment there was only silence. The empty, waiting silence that I now recognized as a sign of its presence. The absence of all the small sounds that should have filled the night. And then, from somewhere out in the darkness, I heard an answer. Not a howl, not a growl, not words in any language I recognized. Just a single low note, sustained and resonant, rising from the hills like the voice of the land itself. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10, and then it faded into the night, leaving behind a silence that felt different somehow, softer, less hungry. I stood there for a while longer, breathing in the cool night air, feeling the trembling warmth of Blue's body against my legs. And when I finally went back inside, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again for a long time. Peace. That was 3 years ago. I still live at the ranch now, in a trailer I set up about 100 yards from the main house. I never went back to Austin, never went back to construction. Instead, I help Emmett with the cattle operation, and I've started doing some custom metal work on the side, gates and fences and decorative pieces that I sell to other ranches in the area. It's not the life I planned, but then again, I'm not the person I planned to be either. The creature is still out there. I see it sometimes. On nights when the moon is full and the air is still. A shape on the ridge, a shadow moving through the cedars, eyes that catch the light and hold it for a moment before blinking out. We don't interact exactly. Not in any way I could explain to someone who hasn't lived through what I've lived through. But there's an understanding between us now, an acknowledgement. I know what it is, and it knows that I know. And somehow that knowledge has changed the relationship between us from predator and prey to something more like neighbors who share a fence line but keep to themselves. I've never told anyone the full truth of what happened. The handful of people who know pieces of the story, my boss in Austin, who eventually accepted my resignation with a confused but genuine well wishes, a therapist in Fredericksburg who I saw for a few months and who probably thinks I suffered some kind of stress-induced psychotic break, a woman I dated briefly last year who couldn't understand why I refused to take her camping in the back country. They all have fragments, shadows, the kind of partial truth that sounds plausible enough to satisfy without requiring belief in the impossible. The people who know the real truth are fewer. Emmett, obviously. Dale Hutchins, the neighbor rancher who laughed off my mountain lion theory 3 years ago and who, I eventually learned, had his own encounter back in the 70s that he'd never talked about until I told him mine. A retired game warden named Mary Castillo, who stopped by the ranch one afternoon, and after about 3 hours of careful conversation, revealed that she'd been documenting unusual wildlife activity in the hill country for 30 years, and had a file full of reports that would never see the light of official day. People see things out here, she told me, sitting on Emmett's porch with a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. They've been seeing things for as long as there have been people to see them. The tribes called it different names: shapeshifter, skinwalker, the one who hunts in darkness. The Spanish missionaries wrote about demons in the wilderness. The German settlers who came after thought it was some kind of Waldgeist, a forest spirit from the old country that had somehow followed them across the ocean. She shook her head slowly. But they're all describing the same thing, the same presence, the same power. And they all learned the same lesson. You don't fight it. You don't run from it. You just learn to live alongside it and hope it decides you're worth keeping around. That's the lesson I've taken to heart in the years since that night on Highway 290. The lesson that's shaped everything about the life I've built here, in this place where the old things still walk and the darkness holds more than most people dare to imagine. I don't sleep with the lights on anymore. I don't flinch at every sound in the night. Don't freeze at every shadow that moves at the edge of my vision. I've learned to live with the truth, to carry it the way I carry all the other hard knowledge I've accumulated over the years. The deaths of people I loved, the failures I can never undo, the simple, brutal fact that the universe is indifferent to human suffering and human hope. But I've also learned something else, something that Emmett tried to tell me that first morning when we sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and not talking about what we'd both seen. The people who disappear, he said, are the ones who try to forget, the ones who pretend, the ones who go back to their regular lives and act like nothing happened. I've watched it happen. In the 3 years since my encounter, I've met half a dozen people who had their own brushes with the thing in the hills, hunters and hikers and ranchers who saw something they couldn't explain and made the choice to deny what they'd witnessed. Some of them left the area entirely, fleeing to cities and suburbs where they could lose themselves in crowds and noise and the comfortable illusion of human control. A few of them are still around, going about their daily lives with a haunted look in their eyes and a desperate determination not to think about what waits in the darkness beyond their porch lights. 3 of them have disappeared. I don't know what happened to them. Not exactly, but I can guess. I can imagine them in their beds at night telling themselves that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, that there was some rational explanation for what they'd seen. I can imagine them walking out to their cars one morning or taking a shortcut through a stretch of woods they'd walked 100 times before, still refusing to believe, still denying. And I can imagine what found them there. In those moments of willful blindness, what had been waiting, patient and old, for them to forget that it was real. The creature doesn't hunt those who believe. That's what I've come to understand. It doesn't need to. The believers, the ones who accept the truth and learn to live with it, they're no threat to whatever ancient purpose the thing serves, whatever role it plays in the hidden order of this land. They've become part of the pattern, part of the understanding that has governed this place since before human memory. It's the deniers who disappear, the ones who try to forget, the ones who insist on seeing the world as a place where such things cannot exist, even after they've seen the proof with their own eyes. I think about that sometimes in the quiet hours of the evening when the sun has set and the darkness has gathered over the hills, and I can feel that ancient presence out there, watching, waiting, remembering. I think about how close I came to being one of the deniers. How easy it would have been to drive back to Austin, to bury myself in work and routine, and the numbing comfort of a life that didn't require me to believe in monsters. I think about the sound it made that night when I stood on the porch and acknowledged what I knew. That single low note, resonant and strange, that felt like an answer and a warning and a welcome all at once. And I think about the choice I made, the choice to stay, the choice to remember, the choice to become something different than the man I was before. Emmett died last spring, peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 78. I found him in his bed when he didn't come down for breakfast, and for a long moment I just stood there in his doorway, looking at the still, quiet shape of the man who had taught me more about life and death and the hidden truths of this world than anyone else I'd ever known. We buried him on the ridge behind the ranch house in a plot he'd picked out years ago with a view of the hills he'd loved his whole life. I said a few words. Blue howled at the moon that night, a sound I'd never heard him make before and haven't heard since. And somewhere out in the darkness, from the direction of the cedars that grew along the north fence line, I heard an answering call, long and mournful and ancient, a farewell in a language older than speech. The ranch is mine now, the cattle, the land, the old house, with its locked doors and its heavy curtains and its secrets that I'm still learning to understand. The responsibility of being the one who knows, the one who remembers, the one who will someday have to pass this truth on to whoever comes after me. I don't know how long I'll live out here. Don't know how many more years I'll spend walking these fence lines, watching these hills, listening for sounds in the darkness that most people would give anything never to hear. But I know this much. I'm not running anymore. I'm not pretending. I'm not trying to forget. I've made my peace with the monster, or maybe it's made its peace with me. Either way, we're neighbors now, sharing this land the way neighbors have always shared it, with respect, with caution, with the understanding that some boundaries should never be crossed. And on the nights when I see those eyes at the tree line, amber green and ancient, watching me with that terrible, patient intelligence, I don't look away. I meet that gaze, hold it for as long as I can bear, and then I nod. A small acknowledgement, a recognition between two beings who have found a way to coexist in a world that most people will never truly understand. It nods back sometimes, I think. It's hard to tell with a face like that. But that's the nature of living with monsters. You never really know where you stand. You never really feel safe. You just learn to carry the fear the same way you carry all the other hard truths that life has taught you. And you keep going. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is forgetting. And I've seen what happens to the ones who forget.